For the night's rest that we've had. Thank you for this cool morning air that wakes us up and reminds us of what it's like to be out in nature. Be with this lecture. Help there to be something in it that will be important. Help there to be something in it that will help in these last days. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. This is called Tactics of New World Order Agents. And to understand the significance of their tactics, we must first understand the area of law that the New World Order is intent on destroying. And to do this, we need a brief background in what's called the 1,000 years history of the rights of Englishmen. And this period of time is from the end of the 7th century to the end of the 17th century. And again, it's known as the 1,000-year battle for the rights of Englishmen. And we'll talk for a moment about two highlights of that battle. The first one took place in 1215 in Runnymede, England, where English nobles forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. And in the Magna Carta, among other things, the Crown had to receive permission to prosecute a common man or woman for a crime. And the way they received that is they had to give the evidence to a grand jury. And the grand jury made the determination whether or not the Crown had enough evidence that a crime had been committed and that possibly the person they were accusing had committed the crime. If the grand jury did not give them permission, they could not prosecute anyone. The second thing that came out of that everyone here has heard a little bit about is called the petit jury, or the trial jury. And the trial jury consisted of 12 good and true men. And these men had to be friends of or acquaintances of the accused. And the reason for that is because under the English system of law, one of the elements of every crime is called mens rea. And what mens rea means is guilty mind. In other words, if there wasn't the intent in the mind to commit a crime, under the old English system of law, no matter what was done, no crime was committed. Because without the intent to commit a crime, no one could be adjudged guilty. So the trial jury, the 12 jurors, had to be acquainted with or know the accused. Because only by being acquainted with or knowing the accused could they have any chance of judging the state of mind that that person had when they did the action that they were being tried for. The other thing that we'll use as a highlight of this legal system that the New World Order is intent on completely destroying is the trial of William Penn in 1670 in England. In 1664, the English Parliament passed what's called the Conventicle Act. And that act forbade the meeting, known then as conventicle, of more than 5 persons in an unlicensed religious meeting. And on August 14, 1670, William Penn and William Meade were arrested for preaching the Quaker doctrine. And the street they were preaching it on has a very interesting name. It was Grace Church Street. No attorney would defend William Penn because this act had the penalty of death. And they wouldn't defend him because they figured he was completely guilty because he had been there preaching. So Penn simply based his defense on his understanding of the Bible. And he spoke very simply and very eloquently. there was a 3-judge panel that was trying Penn, and there was a jury. And at the end of the brief trial, the chief judge turned to the jurors and said, "We order you to go and bring back a guilty verdict." So the jurors retired to deliberate, and 4 of the jurors could not bring themselves to giving a guilty verdict. One of the jurors' name was Edward Bushell. And Edward Bushell was a very wealthy merchantman, owned a lot of ships and stores and so forth. So they came back to the courtroom and they said, "Your Honor, he's not guilty." 5 more times they were told to go back and bring back a guilty plea. Those 4 men refused to bring back a guilty plea on William Penn, so finally all 12 of the jurors were thrown into jail, into what was called the stinking hole. And they weren't allowed any food or any bathroom facilities. And there were other prisoners who had been in the stinking hole, and they didn't clean it out between people being in there. 2 days later, the 12 men were brought back into court, smelling of urine and feces, and told again they had to find William Penn guilty. Edward Bushell spoke for the 4 that could not bring themselves to find him guilty. And Edward Bushell said, "My conscience is not for sale." So they fined all 12 jurors 40 marks, which was a very large fine in 1670, and sent them back to jail. Someone went to a lower court and filed what's called a writ of habeas corpus to free Edward Bushell. And the habeas corpus literally means produce the body and show the authority by which the body is held. So William Bushell was freed, and when he was freed from jail on that writ of habeas corpus, the Conventicle Act died a permanent death. Because one of the other things that's a basis of the Old English system of law is that the jury has the ability not only to judge the actions, but to judge the law. And if the law is not a just law, the jurors understood that they were compelled to bring back a ruling of innocent, no matter what the person had done, because it was not so much the person's actions that were on trial as it was the justness and rightness of the law they supposedly broke. This was known as jury nullification. And so if the jurors let somebody go free because they thought the law that supposedly he'd broken was an unjust law, the jury had nullified that law and it no longer had any effect. It was in the colonial America that these rights of Englishmen were put to the ultimate test. All of us has heard of the document known as the Declaration of Independence. That document wasn't signed by Americans. That document was signed by Englishmen. Those men were Englishmen. They were under the laws of England. America was just a dream at that time. And they signed that with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, and they mutually pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Those men that signed that document, those Englishmen, placed everything, including the future of their families, in God's hands. While the battle for the rights of Englishmen was being fought, there was another battle going on. And that was the battle for absolute control of mankind under the banner of Catholicism. Roman law, Roman civil law, and Roman Catholic canon law combined to give the world a glimpse of the fury that would come in the last days by making possible such bright spots in the history of the world as the Spanish Inquisition in the Dark Ages. The type of law that came out of that system stood on the principle that was articulated in the old Roman Corpus Juris Civilis, which says that the command of the king has the force of law. The end result for the battle of absolute control of mankind is today called inquisitorial law. And that's the type of law that's practiced in Mexico and on the European continent. To understand inquisitorial law, let me explain it to you the way it was explained to me in law school. And it's explained this way. Inquisitorial law is the opposite of common law. Under the common law, a man is presumed innocent until he is proven guilty. Under inquisitorial law, a man is presumed guilty until he proves his innocence. Under the common law, if you so choose, you can have an attorney, an advocate there, to speak in your behalf to the court. Under inquisitorial law, you can have an attorney there, but the attorney is not an advocate. He cannot say a word to the court in your behalf. All he can do is advise you how to answer the questions you're asked, but you have to answer them in your own voice. Under the common law, the judge cannot question the accused. Under inquisitorial law, there's a 3-judge panel, and they may at any time they want to question the accused. And the accused has to answer the questions. There's no Fifth Amendment privilege under inquisitorial law. Which law would you rather be tried under, by the way? We're told in the Great Controversy, page 441, that republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation, and that these principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. 5 Testimonies, page 451, tells us that when our country shall repudiate every principle of its Constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, then we shall know that the end is near. Now, to understand what's said, we need to understand the terms that are used. What's the meaning of republicanism? Republicanism is a system where the sovereign power resides in the people who elect representatives who are responsible to the people who elected them. Republicanism was an idea born from an understanding of several Bible verses, including Hebrews 8:10, which says, I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. From this idea came the belief that the authority of law resided in the bosom of the common person, not in some governmental official somewhere else. What's the meaning of Protestantism? It comes from the root word protest. And the legal definition of protest is a written expression of disagreement over the justice or injustice of a particular system. And has come to signify those who adhere to the Christian principles that derive from the Reformation, the protestants of the injustice of the Catholic religion. How close are we to those tenets being repudiated? We're very close. Let's look at the facts and see. Every time legislature passes a law that removes or alters a long-standing freedom, we are drawn closer to the state of absolute tyranny in this country. Tyranny, the legal definition, and those are the definitions that you have to understand in this light. The legal definition of tyranny is a government in which absolute power is vested in a single ruler. Or if you please, a government such as was described in Corpus Juris Civilis in ancient Rome, where the command of the king has the force of law. Or the command of the president, when he writes an executive order, has the force of law. Now, let's examine a few tactics of New World Order agents which could be described, and I'm going to lift words from the Declaration of Independence for a moment, as a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object, evincing a design to reduce us under absolute despotism. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. To reduce us to absolute despotism means a complete about-face from common law, from those rights of Englishmen that were won in that 1,000-year period of time. That means replacing our God-given rights with privileges. And these privileges are sold to us as in the best interest of the public good. We are people who have lost the concept that our founding fathers understood that eternal vigilance is a price of freedom. We have instead become a people that Johann von Goethe, 1749 to 1832, was describing when he said, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free." And if there's anyone under this tent today who believes they're free, I don't want to burst your bubble. You are in deeper chains of slavery than any American slave freed by the Emancipation Proclamation ever dreamed of being enslaved to. What's the proof? Part of the proof is the war on drugs. War's over, drugs won. They're still fighting a few skirmishes, but the results of those skirmishes is a reduction of your freedoms and your rights. Let's look at some of the results of the war on drugs. I want to tell you the story of Dr. Richard Lowe. Dr. Lowe practiced medicine in a small Alabama town. His basic charge for an office visit in the mid-1980s was still $5. He lived in a modest home. He drove a used car. He had consolidated all of his savings to help support a private K-12 school in his hometown, which was about to go under due to financial difficulties. The FBI noted his consolidation of savings from different bank accounts into one account. And they seized his bank account under the war against drugs because under the war on drugs and the laws that were passed, no one would consolidate their funds into one account unless it was to purchase drugs. There is no other reason under the laws passed on the war against drugs. Yet Dr. Lowe had not committed a crime, but in the United States today, law enforcement can presume from certain actions that you are intending to commit a crime. His reward was a trumped-up criminal charge from a grand jury that no longer protected the rights of the common man. It was merely a rubber stamp for the prosecutor. And I doubt that there is many grand juries anywhere in this country that's any more than a rubber stamp, whether they are state or federal. It took 6 years of legal battle before a United States Court of Appeals finally cleared Dr. Lowe of any charges. Yet all this time the U.S. Attorney and the FBI knew that Dr. Lowe had not committed any crime, but they did not care. Why? Because under the war against drugs, a short-sighted Congress had given law enforcement the power to seize property and force the owner to prove that the property was not ill-gotten gains. And by the way, there are specific guidelines that state when property is seized and it is sold, if it is not cash money, that every agency that took part in that seizure gets a certain percentage of the proceeds, even if the person is later proven innocent by court. And it's very seldom that any of those proceeds are ever regained by the person who lost them. Let's look at the story of Willie Jones. Willie Jones was a black nurseryman who did not have a credit card. He paid cash for an airline ticket to make a trip to purchase nursery stock, and he carried cash with him to purchase the stock. Willie's mistake was that by paying cash for his ticket, he fit a profile. Only a drug dealer would pay cash for an airline ticket under the war against drugs. Willie was turned in by a careless airline ticket agent who alerted law enforcement because she knew she would get 10% of any cash Willie had on him. This, ladies and gentlemen, has been federal law since the mid-1980s. And you didn't know that? You mean they didn't tell you that on the evening news? You mean you didn't read it in your newspaper? Quit watching the evening news and reading newspaper and believing what they tell you. The money to buy the stock for Willie's nursery was confiscated. And it was discovered that this particular airline agent had turned in hundreds of people for purchasing their tickets with cash and had made thousands of dollars in the process, tax-free. In 1991, the Drug Enforcement Agency agents destroyed the gardening supply business of Michael and Christine Sandnes in California because they sold perfectly legal grow lights that some of you may have in your home right now. Why? Because the DEA agent said that the only people who used grow lights were those who intended to hide their cultivation of marijuana. Therefore, the gardening supply business was determined by the DEA to be facilitating the drug trade. What happened to the Sandnesses? They so completely had their life destroyed that they could not afford to go to court and mount any defense on their behalf. And that is the standard operating procedure of federal agents today. If they decide they are going to target somebody rightly or wrongly, they will target you so thoroughly and so completely you will not be able to pay an attorney to go to court and defend you. And that, ladies and gentlemen, has been the practice in this country for at least 16 years. Innocent people can lose their property for no other reason than reporting suspected criminal activity of someone else. Why? Because under the law, only a conspirator would have knowledge of criminal activity, so why would you pick up the phone and dial 1-800 report a crime? Unless you think that somehow it's your moral responsibility and you don't realize that you are being brainwashed into picking up the phone someday without thinking and dialing 1-800 report a Sabbath keeper. One of the basic rights under our system of laws used to be the presumption of innocence until you were proven guilty. This presumption is to a large degree gone. Americans are being slowly acclimatized to tyranny, just like the proverbial frog that's stuck in the pot of water and the water's turned up slowly and imperceptibly till he's boiled to death. You, my friends, are sitting in a pot of water and it's turned up slowly and imperceptibly and it's about to the boiling point, and most of us don't even realize that it's happening. Anyone ever heard of the Exxon Valdez? If you were to go to Prince William Sound on the coast of Alaska today, you would not be able to tell that there had ever been 11 million gallons of oil spilled. You could not tell it today. Yet that's what happened 12 years ago. Under the law, Exxon faced cleanup costs and civil tort damages for negligence. 11 months after the spill, a United States Justice Department attorney convinced a federal grand jury that Exxon was guilty of criminal activity. Anybody remember who the president was at this time? got the same name as the president today, just happened to be his father. This was a conservative Republican Justice Department. And what they did was they said that their innovative legal approach was to assume that Exxon ran the Valdez aground with the criminal intention of polluting the water and killing migratory birds. Now all that they needed to do was to find the laws to support that contention. Do you think they were successful? Yeah, they were. There was a 5-count indictment. 2 of the counts were magicked, created out of the Clean Water Act and the Refuse Act. These acts were designed to punish towns, cities, and businesses from discharging waste without a permit and to permit the usage of waterways as garbage bins. And the Department of Justice claimed that $150 million in 1989 of crude oil accidentally spilled into Prince William Sound, and that was refuse matter thrown, discharged, or deposited by Exxon without a permit. A 3rd count charged Exxon with violating the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which prohibited the hunting and killing of migratory birds without a permit. The Department of Justice charged Exxon with spilling oil in order to kill birds without a license. Counts 4 and 5 came from the Posts and Waterways Act and the Dangerous Cargo Act, which requires tankers to be manned by competent personnel. The Department of Justice charged that one of the world's largest companies improperly hired incompetent people to squander its assets and jeopardize its profits. Now, what did Exxon do about it? One of the biggest companies in this country. You think they went to court and fought it? No, they knew the legal system was so corrupt that no matter how much money they spent, they would lose. So, on top of millions and millions of dollars of cleanup costs, they settled out of court for $125 million because it was cheaper to pay the federal government $125 million on top of losing $150 million worth of oil plus millions and millions of dollars worth of cleanup costs than it was to hire an attorney to fight a corrupt legal system 12 years ago. Now, what chance do you think you have? What real chance do you think you have? And you think you have rights? You think you live in the land of the free and the home of the brave? If you live in it, you're brave, but you're not free. Do another example. Is that enough? Or is that enough examples for right now? Let me put this thing back together. No, Mr. Bush did not own Exxon. Mr. Bush was the president. It was his Justice Department that prosecuted Exxon.
There's a legal group right now called Right Way Law.
Don't mess with Right Way Law. I know every one of them.
We are.
I can tell you, I am not going to tell you the examples on camera. Come to the round table. Enough said for now. I know what I'm talking about, ma'am. Very much so. Another example is a Department of Justice frame-up of a 73-year-old man named Benjamin Lacey. Benjamin Lacey was a businessman who produced apple juice in Virginia. And the company had to submit every year under the Clean Water Act, they had to submit reports to the federal government about tests done on the stream that crossed through their property to prove that they were not polluting the stream. These test results had to be run by particular laboratories, and the forms had to be filled. Over an 11-year period of time, these forms that had to be filed multiple times a year, A few of them had incorrect information put on them because the reports weren't back yet, so they made a telephone call. And sometimes they were given the right results, sometimes the results were wrong. But on October 7, 1994, Bill Clinton's Congress approved an assistant attorney general named Louis J. Schiffler. And for Miss Schiffler to get approved as Assistant Attorney General of the United States, she had to promise the Democratic congressman she would round up some white-collar criminals. So Mr. Lacey was targeted to be a white-collar criminal. And they took these reports over an 11-year period of time, and about 5 or 6 of them had incorrect information on them. And they charged Mr. Lacey with criminal conspiracy to pollute a stream in the state of Virginia. And they were able to get the court to disallow any testimony to the fact that that stream was probably one of the cleanest in the state. Nothing could be given in that court as to the current condition of the stream. And Mr. Lacey was found guilty. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't understand it by now, they can put you any place they want to put you with modern technology, make you say anything they want you to say, and make you guilty of any crime they want you guilty of. And you have no defense. Another of the rights of Englishmen was the ability to know that all new laws were to take effect in the future, not in the past, because it was unfair to punish somebody for something they did way back there that was perfectly legal, but somewhere up here was made illegal. On October 21, 1787, Trench Cox wrote in his pamphlet, Examination of the Constitution for the United States of America, laws made after the commission of the fact have been a dreadful engine in the hands of tyrannical governors. Some of the most virtuous and shining characters in the world have been put to death by laws formed to render them punishable for parts of their conduct which innocence permitted and which patriotism impelled them. These have been called ex post facto laws and are exploded by the new system. Has that survived? No. Anybody remember the tax increase voted by Congress in December of 1987 and made retroactive to January 1 of the same year? Blatantly unconstitutional under the administration of who? Who was the president in December of 87? Ronald Reagan. Well, we could go back a little further than that. How about 1980? Jimmy Carter had just lost to Ronald Reagan. But Jimmy Carter wanted a particular law passed, so in the lame duck session of Congress, he went to Howard Baker, the Republican whip, the minority leader of Congress, a man who I used to live just a few miles away from. And he asked Howard Baker to push the law through. And they did. It was pushed through even though it had no chance of passage otherwise. This was considered to be good politics. So that in the transition from a Democratic president to a very popular Republican president, this would show that the new Republican administration was going to do the right thing when it came to the environment. What's this law called? The nickname for it is called Superfund, or the lawyer's money pit. The long name for it is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA. What this act does, in effect, is it allows the federal government to look at a piece of property. And if they determine that that piece of property is contaminated, They can go back over 100 years if necessary to find out each person or company or corporation that owned that land over that period of time. And they can look for anybody, any company, any corporation that is in existence today that descended from the owners of that land and charge any one of them they choose with a cleanup of the pollution on that site. I know of a site about 3 hours away from here, which for several years was used, a trench was dug and it was used as a dump site. It was on land that nobody lived on. For a period of time, there was a small hospital, a small Adventist hospital, that some of their refuse was dumped in that site. At that time, the small Adventist hospital was an independent hospital. It was later taken over by one of the conferences. About 5 years ago, someone complained. They said, you know, there were 3 kids that live along the stream that runs by this dump site that have been diagnosed with leukemia. We think there's something in the dump site. Once that was said, the conference that owned that hospital immediately spent over $200,000 cleaning up that dump site without going to court, even though the kids lived upstream. This is another example of how the rights of Englishmen have been lost to greater good. We've got to save the environment, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, I'd like to tell you of a trial. The story, the end of the trial, ended on a cold black night on March 15, 1938. Nikolai Bukharin was a high-ranking communist official. He had been proclaimed by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin as the golden boy of the Bolshevik Revolution. Bukharin controlled the Soviet press from his Kremlin apartment that he shared with his wife Anna Larina and his 1-year-old son Yuri. But the golden boy of the revolution and the controller of the Soviet press was no protection from persecution and the death penalty when Joseph Stalin decided that Bukharin had outlived his usefulness. Bukharin was arrested on a trumped-up charge of planning to assassinate Lenin, who was dead and could not testify. Some 20 years earlier, to keep the Tsar in power, he was summoned to come to an office of the Kremlin where he was arrested, and simultaneously his apartment was ransacked in the presence of his wife and son, and all of his papers and other possessions were seized. After the officials, the officers, ransacked his apartment, they went into his kitchen and cooked up the last bacon and eggs and ate it themselves before leaving, knowing that his wife and his young son had nothing else in the apartment to eat. Bukharin was held in prison and subjected to the cornerstone of Soviet jurisprudence, the rating of a man's innocence by the hardness of his constitution and his guilt by the sensibility of his nerves. This was the polite way of saying we can torture anyone into confessing anything we want them to confess. For 3 months, Bukharin withstood some of the worst torture you could imagine. Then they came to him and they said, Mr. Bukharin, if you do not sign this confession, we will murder your wife and your child. In short order, he signed the confession. Now it was easy. All they needed to do was go through the formality of a trial. So I'll describe the trial. It was held in the Soviet House of Trade. It was the Tsar's former Nobles Club. It was a 3-story marble building with great columns in front of it. And the trial was held in a large hall with crystal chandeliers and baby blue walls. There was a crudely built, brown-stained prisoner's dock. There were 3 chairs. There was a long prosecutor's table, and then there was a high raised area where the judges would come in. They came in through red velvet curtains. The day of the trial, There were all kinds of people there. There were several hundred people to come in. Most of the people to come in happened to be paid KGB agents who were paid to, at the proper time, make the jeers or the cheers that the newspaper could report. The bailiff stood up and says, "Everyone rise, the judges are coming." And everyone stood up, and in came 4 judges dressed up in Soviet military uniforms and sat down. Buchanan was brought in and put in the trial box. 3 gentlemen came in and sat down in the 3 chairs. They were the defense attorneys, but they weren't allowed to speak. They were just window dressing. So there could be a picture printed in the newspaper showing his defense attorneys. Now, the prosecutor was Prosecutor General Andrei Vyshinsky. He had horn-rimmed glasses, a blue double-breasted suit, gray hair, a distinguished forehead, and looked for all the world like a Wall Street attorney in New York. All Vyshinsky had to do was to concoct an elaborate story that no one would be able to say anything against, and put paid witnesses and informants on the stand, and have those paid witnesses and informants convict Buchanan. And since Buchanan had already signed the confession and knew if he did not plead guilty in court his wife and son would be killed, it was simple. After this farce of a trial was over, Buchanan pled guilty. 6 hours later, he was taken out and a gun was put to his head and he was shot for the crimes that he had committed. Boy, aren't you glad nothing like that could happen in America? Let me tell you of another trial. Now, I'll tell you ahead of time, this trial didn't quite end the same way. This trial took place in a courtroom about 300 miles from here. 300 miles in any direction is United States of America. The defendant was a local high school teacher. The defendant's alive and well today. I've talked to him. I have a complete transcript of his trial at home, so I will not identify the city that the trial took place in, nor will I identify his name.
What year was it?
That will come out in a moment. I'm also acquainted with one of the 2 attorneys that defended him. And I've talked to this attorney at some length about this case. The prosecutor was an assistant United States attorney. The charge was violation of a law which you cannot find in any law book in this country. Repeatedly during the course of the trial, paid, trained informants were put on the stand to give testimony as to the guilt of this man. Repeatedly through the course of the trial, because his relatives had helped him purchase good, competent legal counsel, and he had put his house up as a bond to be able to be out of jail and help prepare his defense. Repeatedly, the 2 defense attorneys were able to confuse the paid, trained witnesses on the witness stand. Repeatedly, the prosecution was asked to produce a copy of the law that had been violated, and repeatedly the prosecution failed to produce a copy of the law in 1994, December. It was a jury trial. After the jury came back and gave their verdict, 9 women voted to convict the man. The 3 men on the jury said he wasn't guilty. In 1994, in federal court in America, it took a 12-zip to make you guilty. Today, 9-3 sends you to jail. All it takes for 9-3 to send you to jail is for a deal to be cut between your attorney and the prosecuting attorney in several different states and in some federal courts today. When the jury was polled, the 9 women said he was guilty because their husband had to obey the same law, and if their husbands had to obey it, he had to obey it. It made no difference that they could not prove the law existed. Now, I'm not saying this to be a statement against the 9 women. Bless their hearts, they were just doing what they thought were right because a long time ago their conscience had been turned off and they had no moral compass left inside their bodies. The 3 men, by the way, had been obeying the law all of their life, but they realized that the prosecution could not prove that it was a valid law. So, let's look at the similarities between the Soviet Union in 1938 and America in 1994. In both countries, the accused was arrested, but no law had been broken. In America, the accused was able to use his house as a bond and be out of jail for the duration of the trial. In both countries, the accused was tortured, physically in the Soviet Union, but mentally and emotionally in America, because he was repeatedly told if he did not plead guilty, they would put him in jail and take everything he owned. Anybody here want to contradict that that is a form of torture? In both countries, the prosecution used paid, trained witnesses to testify against the accused. For fairness, let's point out the difference. The Soviet Union, the accused had his apartment ransacked and his papers and belongings taken. In the Soviet Union, the defense attorneys were just window dressing. In the Soviet Union, there was no opportunity for an appeal. 6 hours after the trial, Buchanan was shot. In the Soviet Union, there was no jury. Okay. Anybody want to guess what could happen today? Anybody want to take some time later this week and drive with me both places within a 6-hour drive from here and have me point out houses to you that in the last 15 months were ransacked and anything that was wanted taken by federal agents without a valid search warrant? And it was taken to build a case against the people because 2 years of a federal investigation did not turn up a crime. So they needed more evidence to bring a crime, charges of a crime against them. And I'm talking about the United States, ladies and gentlemen, and you think you have rights. Doesn't have to be answered here. I'm sorry, that's one question I can't answer, because it really makes no difference. As Adventists, we do not have any special privileges, nor can we claim any, over the drunk in the gutter in any city in this country. In the Soviet Union, the defense attorneys were just window dressing. What happens in this country, what's happening more and more, it's becoming more expedient for defense attorneys to plea bargain. What's a plea bargain? A plea bargain is a concocted lie that the person being prosecuted agrees to, because if he agrees to lie that he was guilty for something, then at least it won't be as bad as what he could be convicted of, no matter how good his attorney is. So now we're down to basically two differences: the opportunity for an appeal and a jury. Already in this country, federal prosecutors and federal judges are questioning the necessity of a jury in a criminal trial, and have been questioning it for several years. So then all that's left is an appeal. And already in some areas of law in this country, they are limiting the appeal. Right now it's being limited mostly to capital crimes, people who have been convicted of a crime with which they will pay for their life. And they're limiting the number of appeals they can make. Anybody happen to watch network news last week and see the lady from Oklahoma City that ran the crime lab that in the past 15 or 20 years has sent hundreds of people to jail? And the first man got out because DNA evidence proved he did not commit the rape. He had been in there for 15 years. When he went in, he had 2 twin boys, 1 year old. He and his wife decided to divorce. That way the boys would not have to grow up thinking and being taunted about their father being in the penitentiary for a rape that the man and his wife knew he did not commit. And this same lady who collaborated with federal prosecutors and the FBI had sent 15 people to death row. 7 of them have already been executed. And 10 years ago, a federal appeals judge questioned her abilities in a court opinion and nobody paid any attention to it. And you think you have rights? You think you live in the land of the free, the home of the brave? You think there's a constitution to protect you? You think there are laws to protect you? Some 100 years ago, a frail, gray-haired lady wrote these words. When Protestantism shall stretch her hands across the gulf to grasp the hand of the Roman power, when she shall reach over the abyss to clasp hands with spiritualism, when under the influence of this threefold union our country shall repudiate every principle of its constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, and shall make provisions for the propagation of papal falsehoods and delusions, then we may know that the time has come for the marvelous working of Satan and that the end is near. As the approach of the Roman armies was assigned to the disciples of the impending destruction of Jerusalem, so may this apostasy be assigned to us, that the limit of God's forbearance is reached and the measure of our nation's iniquity is full, and that the angel of mercy is about to take her flight, never to return. 5 Testimony 4:51. This same lady wrote in Evangelism, page 235, there will be a national apostasy which will end in national ruin. When you understand that our country was based on biblical principles called the common law, the result of the 1,000-year struggle for the rights of Englishmen, and it was called common law because at that time approximately 75% of the education of the common man came out of the King James Bible. So it was common knowledge. So the common man, knowing the principles of the common law, could go to court and defend himself and beat the attorneys of the day by quoting the Bible. Anybody want to try to go to court today and quote the Bible? Some courts will let you get by with it. Some of them might stop you in the middle and hold you in contempt. I believe that it's Satan's design to hide from us the fact that our country and the laws of our country were based on the Bible. I think it's Satan's design to make us want to look and focus our attention on just one area. They haven't passed a national Sunday law yet, so I'm okay. I don't have to sell my place and move out into the country yet. I don't have to learn how to do this. I don't have to get rid of this. I'm still okay. But when they pass that national Sunday law, I know I'm going to put it all up for sale. I'm going to be gone. I don't think it works that way. If we're living with that mindset, I've got a sneaky feeling that the large majority of the people here had no idea of the things I've told you in this last 50-some minutes. Now that you're aware of that, can you honestly sit there and tell me that all you have to wait for to know that this country that was based on biblical principles is not on the edge of national apostasy, is just waiting for a national Sunday law to be passed? If there's anybody who's still of that opinion, that mindset, I want you to know that you've been set up. You have been set up to be blindsided by the cunning of our enemy. When this country abandons that which made it great, Protestantism and republicanism, and replaces those two great principles with the same type of injustice towards citizens as Nikolai Bukharin experienced in 1938 Russia. Why can't you see that we're already living in the first stages, maybe the very late first stages of national apostasy? If you're waiting for a national Sunday law to wake you up and deepen your relationship with God, are you sure you would recognize a national Sunday law when it was passed? Do you remember Genesis 3, 1-5? Remember how it starts out? And the serpent was more subtle than any of the beasts of the field which the Lord God had made. He was so subtle that the second created being lost out in a direct confrontation with him. Is there anybody here who seriously thinks that their knowledge and their mental ability is above that of Eve, who was created by God from Adam's rib, and who was taught in the evening by God Himself? Just what is our relationship? What's the relationship that counts? What's our relationship to God? Yesterday, Pastor Trevs talked about hearing the voice of the shepherd, understanding and knowing the voice of the shepherd. In closing, I want to tell you a brief little story. Happened in 1989. My brother was a helicopter pilot for the Tennessee Army Guard. He was one of 4 pilots from Tennessee that was chosen to go over to Europe for 2 weeks with a 2-week training and fly helicopters that were soon to be retired from active duty. He was to fly these helicopters 1 click, which is 1,000 meters, off the East German border in 1,000-foot elevation. He was to fly under radio silence with a tone coming through his headset. The tone was changed every day. Every day it was a different intensity. It was a different pitch. And as he flew along that border, the East German border wasn't a straight line. It zigged and zagged. And as he would fly along there listening to the tone in his headset, there was a tower on the East German side that was trying to imitate what he was hearing. And if he quit putting his attention on the tone on the western side of the border and was pulled across the border, he was subject to be shot down as an international incident. By the way, he was flying an unarmed helicopter. He had a sidearm, a 9mm pistol, which does a whole lot of good against what they would be shooting at the helicopter with. If he started to stray off course, radio silence by the west was broken by a code. Storm's coming. If that did not get his attention, the next message that came was rain. If that did not get his attention, the last message that was allowed to be given was thunder. If he did not understand storm and rain and thunder, and was drawn across the border by the false voice trying to lure him to his destruction, it would have cost him his life. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bible tells us, Pastor Trevs went over it yesterday, that the Good Shepherd's sheep know Him. They know His voice. A stranger's voice they will not follow. Do you know the voice? Do you know that voice well enough that no matter what the world throws at you, you can always hear that still small voice? Let's bow and pray God that we do. Father in heaven, please be with each person here. Draw them close to you. Put your arm of protection around them as we enter the last days of this earth's history. And more than all, teach us, give us the ability to know your voice. Because only by knowing your voice will we be saved. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. There's a 15-minute break before this lecture right now. Can we bow our heads for prayer? Our Father in heaven,